I saw the way his hand hovered just an inch from the small of her back before the first explosion rocked the Aegis hub. Jack's Thorn, the man the galaxy called the Scourge of Viridia, looked like he was made of polished chrome and hard-edged resolve, but in that second, well, I noticed his fingers were trembling. Just a tiny bit. Lyra didn't pull away. She leaned into that heat, her azure robes shimmering under the artificial suns of the station. Her skin was a pale, luminous blue, and when she looked up at him, the air between them practically hummed with a different kind of energy than the ship's reactor. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a desperate physical recognition. I don't think they even noticed me standing there in the corner of the room. They were alone in a crowded hall, two enemies suddenly finding themselves each other's only anchor. Look, everyone knew the stakes. The Azure Ascendancy and the Sol Coalition had been tearing the stars apart for decades. The war was a grinding thing, a machine that ate people and spat out debris. Then came the diplomats with their fine words and their forced contracts. They decided the only way to stop the bleeding was to bind the two most powerful symbols of the conflict together. Lyra, the voice of the High Citadel, and Jax, the soldier who had burned a sector to save a star system. It was a cold calculation. A political marriage meant to anchor a shaky armistice. Truth is, half the people in that room were probably placing bets on which one would kill the other first. I remember the first time they met on the observation deck. The smell of ozone was thick in the air, a constant reminder of the shields keeping the void at bay. Jack stood there in his dress blues, his cybernetic arm whining softly as he adjusted his posture. He looked like a weapon someone had tried to dress up for a gala. And Lyra? She was all grace and sharp edges. She walked up to him, and the distance between them felt like a canyon. But then, she reached out. She touched the cold metal of his prosthetic, her warm fingers trailing over the sensor nodes. I saw Jax catch his breath. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just watched her with those tired soldier's eyes. The ceremony itself was supposed to be a hollow ritual. We were all standing there in the great hall, watching the holograms flicker with the symbols of two civilizations. The air was charged, expectant. I think we all wanted to believe it would work, but the Void purists had other plans. I saw the flash before I heard the boom, a thermal detonator right at the base of the diplomatic dais. The glass shattered, the lights went red, and for a second, everything was chaos. But I didn't look at the explosion. I looked at them. Jax didn't go for his sidearm first. He went for her. He spun her around, his massive frame shielding her blue-tinted body from the flying shards of crystal. I heard the thud of his heart, or maybe it was the deck plates, vibrating. But the sound was rhythmic and fast. Lyra's hands were buried in the fabric of his tunic, her knuckles white. She wasn't a warrior, but she wasn't a victim either. She looked at him with a raw honesty that I've never seen in a council chamber. And then the doors blew open. I remember the smell of scorched air in the residence on Horizon Prime. It wasn't the clean, filtered scent of the Aegis hub anymore. It was sharp and metallic. I saw them backed against the panoramic window, the city of light sprawling behind them, while the front doors buckled under the weight of the purest breach. Jax didn't look like a legendary commander then. He looked like a man who had finally found something worth keeping. His prosthetic arm was whining, a high-pitched mechanical scream that vibrated through the floorboards. I could feel it in my own teeth. But Lyra, she didn't cower. She reached out and placed her hand over his heart, right over the pulsing light of his combat rig. Truth is, I think that's when the war actually ended. Not in a treaty room, but in that private sanctuary with the walls closing in. The first purist came through the door in a blur of black armor. Jax moved faster than a human should. It was beautiful and terrible to watch. He was the Scourge again, fluid, lethal, a storm of precision. But every time he struck, every time he moved to neutralize a threat, he kept his body anchored between the attackers and Lyra. He was taking hits he shouldn't have taken just to make sure not a single stray spark touched her blue skin. I saw a jagged piece of shrapnel catch him across the cheek, and the blood was so red against the silver of his tech. And Lyra was singing. It's an Azure thing, a low, melodic hum that stabilizes the air. It's supposed to calm the mind, and I swear I saw Jax's movements get even sharper, more rhythmic, as if he was dancing to her voice. But look, the real moment came afterward, when the floor was littered with the remnants of the failed coup and the High Citadel guards finally arrived to find them standing in the center of the wreckage. Jax was breathing hard, his chest heaving, his metal hand covered in the residue of the fight. He turned to her, and for the first time, he didn't wait for her to touch him. He reached out with his human hand, the one that was still warm, still soft, and cupped her face. I saw her eyes flutter shut. She leaned into his palm like it was the only safe place left in the galaxy. They walked out onto that balcony together. The entire High Citadel was watching. The cameras were live to 100 systems. Everyone expected a stiff, formal display of a broken contract. Instead, they got two people who were bleeding for each other. Jax stood tall, his arms still sparking, and Lyra didn't stand behind him. She stood right beside him, their fingers interlaced metal and flesh, Ozzer and human. I remember thinking that the political marriage was dead. What was left was something much more dangerous to the warmongers. It was a choice. They looked out over the horizon of the capital, and I knew the fighting was over. Not because the purists were gone, but because these two had decided that the peace was worth the scars. I saw it myself, the way she gripped his hand when the wind picked up. They weren't just symbols anymore. They were the architects of a new world. And honestly, they looked like they finally belonged to someone. Would you like me to generate a cinematic image of Jax and Lyra standing together on the balcony of the High Citadel?